May 11th, 1982. The air coming off Boston Harbor is thick with the smell of salt and diesel. Headlights cut through the twilight, glinting off the polished chrome of cars parked outside Anthony's Pier 4, a sprawling waterfront restaurant known for its popovers and its powerful clientele. Inside, under the dim lights, deals are made over lobster and steak. Outside, different kinds of deals are settled. Edward Brian Halloran feels the chill, and it is not just the evening air. He has made a fatal mistake, and he knows it. He tried to play both sides, feeding information about the Winter Hill Gang to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, hoping for protection. But the man he is informing on, James Whitey Bulger, has his own source deep inside the Bureau. Halloran's secret is out. He is a marked man. He pushes through the restaurant's heavy doors, his eyes scanning the parking lot. His friend, a legitimate construction worker named Michael Donahue, has offered him a ride home. Donahue knows nothing of Halloran's predicament. He is just a man doing a favor for a neighbor. Halloran slides into the passenger seat of Donahue's blue Datsun, a knot tightening in his stomach. He tells Donahue to hurry. The Datsun pulls out onto Northern Avenue, its tires crunching over loose gravel. They do not get far. A pale sedan, a ghost in the deepening dusk, screeches to a halt beside them, boxing them in. Before Halloran can even process the threat, the passenger side window of the sedan disappears in a spider web of cracks. A figure leans out, a MAC-10 submachine gun cradled in his arms. The weapon is fitted with a bulky, homemade silencer, but its purpose is not stealth. It is control. The first volley of bullets rips through the Datsun's thin metal door. The sound is a deafening metallic roar. Glass explodes inward. Michael Donahue, the innocent man behind the wheel, slumps forward, his life extinguished in an instant. Brian Halloran screams, trying to shield himself as dozens of rounds tear through the car's interior. Another figure emerges from the shadowy sedan, this one with a .30 caliber carbine. It is Whitey Bulger. He raises the rifle, his pale blue eyes cold and empty, and fires methodically into the shredded vehicle, ensuring the job is done. The entire attack lasts less than 20 seconds. The pale sedan peels away, melting back into the city's traffic, leaving behind a scene of carnage. 2 men are dead. One a would-be informant, the other a casualty of a war he did not know he was in. The message is clear and brutal. No one talks. No one crosses Whitey Bulger. This reign of terror, this absolute power to kill with impunity on a public street, was not born in a vacuum. It was forged 7 years earlier in a quiet meeting that would forever stain the reputation of federal law enforcement in Boston. The year was 1975. John Connolly, a rising star in the FBI's Boston office, was a product of the same South Boston housing projects as James Bulger. He saw Bulger not just as a gangster, but as a kindred spirit, a man who understood the city's unwritten codes. Connolly, with the blessing of his supervisor John Morris, arranged a meeting. The rendezvous point was a car parked on a moonlit beach in Quincy, south of the city. Connolly sat in the driver's seat. Beside him was James Bulger. In the back sat Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy, Bulger's psychopathic partner in crime. Connolly laid out the proposition. The FBI's primary target was not the Irish mob. It was the Italian La Cosa Nostra, the patriarcha crime family that controlled New England. The Bureau wanted an inside source, a top-echelon informant who could help them dismantle the mafia from within. In exchange for information on the Italians, Connolly offered Bulger and Flemmy something more valuable than money, a shield. He promised them protection. He would be their handler, their guardian angel inside the system. He would feed them intelligence on rival gangs, warn them of surveillance, and steer investigations away from their burgeoning criminal empire. Bulger, ever the strategist, saw the genius of the arrangement. The FBI would not just ignore his crimes. They would actively help him commit them by eliminating his competition. He agreed. He became designated FBI informant number 1544. In that car, under the stars, a deal with the devil was struck. The blood of Brian Halloran and countless others was the price. The deal was done. As the years ticked by from 1975 into the early 1980s, the arrangement blossomed into a grotesquely successful enterprise for both sides. For John Connolly, it was the key to a legendary career. He walked the halls of the John F. Kennedy Federal Building with a swagger born of confidence. His reports, filled with detailed intelligence on the inner workings of the Patriarcha crime family, were masterpieces of deception. They were fed to him piece by James Bulger and Stephen Flemmi, who carefully curated the information to benefit themselves. When a high-ranking mafioso was arrested, Connolly was the hero agent who had cultivated the source. When a major bookmaking ring was busted, Connolly's file on informant 1544 got another commendation. He was celebrated in the press as the man who was finally taming Boston's organized crime. He bought expensive suits, dined with politicians, and became the face of federal law enforcement in the city. His supervisor, John Morris, also reaped the benefits, his own career advancing on the back of Connolly's manufactured successes. The corruption deepened, evolving from a simple exchange of information to a full-blown criminal partnership. Bulger would slip thick envelopes of cash to Connolly and Morris during lavish dinners, cementing their loyalty with the profits of his crimes. For Bulger, the arrangement was a license to conquer. With the FBI as his silent partner, he and his Winter Hill gang operated with a terrifying freedom. They were ghosts, invisible to the law. While Connolly was busy taking down their Italian rivals, Bulger and Flemmi were expanding their own empire. They ran loan-sharking operations that bled legitimate businessmen dry. They controlled the flow of drugs into South Boston, a racket Bulger had once publicly disavowed, but secretly embraced for its immense profits. And most importantly, they eliminated threats. Anyone who crossed the Winter Hill gang, anyone who owed them money, anyone who even considered talking to the authorities, simply disappeared. Connolly provided the crucial intelligence. He would learn of a grand jury investigation or a potential witness, and a quick, deniable phone call was made. Bulger and Flemmi would take care of the rest. They became the apex predators of the Boston underworld, protected by the very people sworn to bring them down. The brutal reality of this alliance was sealed in the fate of John McIntyre. A fisherman from Quincy, McIntyre had gotten himself entangled in one of Bulger's schemes, a plan to ship 7 tons of high-powered weaponry to the Irish Republican Army aboard a fishing trawler named the Valhalla. The plot was a disaster. The Irish authorities, tipped off by an informant, seized the ship and its cargo off their coast in 1984. McIntyre and the crew were arrested but eventually released. Back in Boston, McIntyre was terrified. He knew he was loose end. He believed naively that the authorities could protect him. He began talking to a United States Customs agent, providing details about the Valhalla and, crucially, about Bulger's role in the operation. The information made its way through law enforcement channels and landed like a death warrant on the desk of John Connolly. The FBI agent did not hesitate. He immediately alerted Bulger that McIntyre was a rat. The hunt was on. In November of 1984, McIntyre was lured to a house on East 3rd Street in South Boston, a property the gang controlled. He walked inside expecting a meeting, a chance to explain himself. Instead, he found Bulger, Flemmi, and other members of the gang waiting for him. They chained him to a chair in the basement. For hours they tortured him, trying to extract the name of every person he had spoken to. Bulger, his voice a low, menacing whisper, pressed him for details, his cold eyes studying McIntyre's face for any sign of deception. Flemmi, ever the sadist, attempted to strangle him with a rope, but it was too thick. Frustrated, Flemmi left the room and returned with a machine gun. He fired a single bullet into the back of McIntyre's head. The interrogation was over. They buried his body in the dirt floor of the basement, another ghost created by the unholy alliance between the FBI and the Winter Hill gang. By the mid-1980s, South Boston was not just a neighborhood, it was a kingdom, and James Whitey Bulger was its undisputed king. His throne was not a chair, but the passenger seat of a car, endlessly circling the tight-knit streets of his domain. He held court from the South Boston Liquor Mart, a business he and Stephen Flemmi had extorted from its owner, Stephen Rakes, for a paltry $67,000. From behind the counter, or from a table at the back of Triple O's Lounge, a grimy bar that served as an unofficial headquarters, Bulger's presence was a constant, oppressive weight. He cultivated an image of the benevolent protector, the local boy who looked after his own. He was known to give out Thanksgiving turkeys to needy families and to stop neighborhood kids from scrawling graffiti. But this was a carefully constructed facade, a mask for the monster beneath. Everyone in Southie knew the truth. They saw the fear in the eyes of shopkeepers who paid their weekly rent to Bulger's enforcer, Kevin Weeks. They heard the whispers of men who vanished after owing a gambling debt. They understood that to even look at Bulger the wrong way was to risk a beating, or worse. Silence was the price of survival. His fortress was built not of brick and mortar, but of the collective terror of an entire community. While John Connolly's faction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation provided an impenetrable shield, other law enforcement agencies were growing increasingly frustrated. The Massachusetts State Police, particularly a tenacious group of detectives led by Colonel Thomas Foley, saw the Winter Hill Gang for what it was, the most dominant and violent criminal organization in the state. They knew Bulger was behind a string of murders and a massive drug trafficking operation, but every time they got close, the trail went cold. In 1986, a state police intelligence unit working with the Drug Enforcement Administration launched a sprawling investigation codenamed Operation Lobster. Their target was the entire organized crime landscape of Boston, but they had a special interest in the Winter Hill Gang. They spent months developing sources, meticulously setting up wiretaps, and running surveillance. They placed a bug in the ceiling of the Lancaster Street garage in the North End, a known hangout for mobsters that Bulger and Flemmi frequently used for meetings. It was a high-risk, high-reward move. The bug captured hours of incriminating conversations. The state police listened as mafia capos discussed extortion, shakedowns, and murder plots. But whenever Bulger or Flemmi were present, the conversations were guarded, almost as if they knew they were being watched. Then one day, the bug went dead. Detectives found that the sophisticated listening device had been crudely ripped from the ceiling. There was no doubt in their minds. Someone had tipped them off. The leaks were constant and blatant. State police would plan a raid on a bookmaking joint, only to arrive and find the place scrubbed clean, the phones disconnected. DEA agents would track a known drug dealer to a meeting with Kevin Weeks, but before they could move in, Weeks would get a call and vanish. The source of the leaks was obvious to Foley and his men. The information was going through the FBI's Boston office for coordination, and it was dying on John Connolly's desk. Foley and his team began to see Connolly not as a colleague, but as an obstructionist, an arrogant agent who protected his prized informants at all costs. They filed complaints, raised alarms with federal prosecutors, but their warnings were dismissed. Connolly was a star, the man who was bringing down the mafia. His informants were considered untouchable assets. The internal war between the state police and the FBI simmered, a bitter institutional rivalry that allowed Bulger to operate with total impunity. He was not just a gangster protected by a corrupt agent. He was a strategic asset, weaponized by one arm of the law against another. This protection allowed him to perfect his most lucrative business, extortion. He and Flemmi began a systematic shakedown of the city's major drug dealers and bookmakers, demanding a tribute, a street tax, for the right to operate. One dealer, a man named John "Red" Shea, was summoned to a meeting and told he now worked for them. He would pay them $50,000 a month. When Shea hesitated, Bulger simply stared at him with his lifeless blue eyes and said, "You are paying. It is not up for discussion." Shea paid. They all did. The calendar turned to 1989. A new decade was looming, and with it came a new wave of federal prosecutors to Boston, men who were not steeped in the city's tribal loyalties and unspoken agreements. Among them was a sharp, methodical assistant United States attorney named Fred Wyshak. He and his team of investigators were sent from Washington with a powerful new weapon in their arsenal, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. This was a law designed not just to jail individual criminals, but to dismantle entire criminal enterprises from the top down. Their primary target was the Patriarcha crime family, which had been weakened but was still a formidable force. Wyshak began his work by the book. He and his organized crime strike force started poring over thousands of pages of documents, surveillance logs, informant reports, and old case files. They were building a massive RICO indictment that would name dozens of made members and associates of the Boston Mafia. In these files, two names appeared over and over again: James Bulger and Stephen Flemmi. They were not listed as targets, but as sources. They were John Connolly's prized informants, the wellspring of intelligence that had powered his career. According to Connolly's reports, Bulger and Flemmy were providing a running commentary on the secret ceremonies, internal power struggles, and criminal plots of the Italian mob. But as Weishaupt and his team dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. The intelligence provided by Bulger and Flemmy was always just enough to indict their rivals, but never enough to expose the full scope of organized crime in the city. The Winter Hill Gang, according to the official FBI record, was a phantom. They were not involved in drugs, they were not involved in murder, they were merely observers of other men's sins. Weishaupt, an outsider with no allegiance to the Boston FBI's internal culture, found this narrative unbelievable. He would sit in meetings where John Connolly, radiating confidence and charm, would hold court, explaining how his informants were the key to everything. Connolly would dismiss any questions about the Winter Hill Gang's own activities. "They are not the problem," he would insist. "The LCN is the problem. My guys are on our side." The state police saw it differently. Colonel Thomas Foley and his detectives, sidelined and ignored for years, finally found a receptive audience in Fred Weishaupt. In quiet meetings, away from the prying eyes of the FBI, they laid out their decade of frustration. They spoke of Operation Lobster, of the compromised wiretaps, of witnesses who clammed up or disappeared right after the FBI was notified. They showed Weishaupt surveillance photos of Connolly meeting with Bulger and Flemmy, not like a handler meeting an informant, but like friends, like partners. They presented a mountain of circumstantial evidence suggesting that the Winter Hill Gang was not just a gang, but a protected species, thriving under the FBI's wing. The turning point came when Weishaupt's team began preparing their grand jury case against the Patriarca family. They wanted to call Stephen Flemmy as a witness. Flemmy had been caught on an FBI bug discussing a shakedown with a Patriarca capo. It was solid evidence, but when Weishaupt informed the FBI of his plan, the reaction was explosive. John Morris, now the supervisor in charge of the organized crime unit, vehemently objected. He argued that forcing Flemmy to testify would blow his cover as an informant and put his life in danger. Weishaupt was stunned. The priority of the FBI seemed to be protecting their informant, not securing a conviction against a mafia soldier. He pushed back, arguing that Flemmy was a material witness to a federal crime. The fight went all the way up the chain of command at the Department of Justice. In the end, a compromise was reached. But the incident shattered any remaining faith Weishaupt had in the integrity of the Boston FBI's operation. He realized the state police were right. The problem was not just the criminals on the street. It was the corruption inside the federal building. The fortress of fear that Bulger had built around South Boston had a second, invisible wall around it, and its bricks were the badges and credentials of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The winter of 1994 was cold in Boston, and a chill of a different kind was creeping through the corridors of the JFK Federal Building. Inside the United States Attorney's Office, the culmination of years of painstaking work lay bound in thick blue folders. A sprawling RICO indictment aimed at decapitating what was left of the Patriarca crime family. But prosecutor Fred Weishaupt and his task force had expanded their scope. Their indictment was not just about the Italians anymore. After countless battles with the Department of Justice higher-ups and over the furious, desperate objections of John Connolly, the indictment now included two more names, James J. Bulger and Stephen J. Flemmy. They were being charged not as murderers or drug lords. The full, horrific extent of their crimes was still a dark secret buried with their victims, but with racketeering and extortion. It was the only way Weishaupt could pierce the protective shield Connolly had built around them. The evidence was solid, based on wiretaps and witness testimony that placed them at the center of a massive shakedown operation targeting bookmakers and drug dealers across the region. For the first time in 2 decades, the law was formally recognizing the Winter Hill Gang, not as a source of intelligence, but as a criminal target. John Connolly knew the end was near. His supervisors, including his old partner John Morris, were now consumed with damage control, distancing themselves from the informants they had once celebrated. Connolly's star had fallen. He was no longer the heroic agent, but a man under a cloud of suspicion. He saw the indictment for what it was, the first domino. If Bulger and Flemmy were arrested, they would talk. They would trade everything they knew about Connolly's corruption, the cash payments, the leaked intelligence, the warnings that led to murder, for a lesser sentence. His life, his career, and his freedom were on the line. He made his choice on December 23, 1994. The city was winding down for the Christmas holiday, decorated with lights and wreaths. But Connolly was not thinking of celebration. He drove to a predetermined meeting spot, a place where he could speak without being seen. He met with Bulger. The conversation was short and grim. Connolly, the FBI agent, looked his prized informant in the eye and delivered the ultimate tip. He told him the sealed indictment was coming down right after the new year. He told him the FBI and the state police were gearing up for a massive takedown. He told him his name, and Flemy's name, were on the warrant. Then he gave him the most important advice of his life. Go. Bulger received the news with the icy calm that had defined his reign. For years, he had meticulously prepared for this exact moment. He had stashed cash, weapons, and false identification documents in safe deposit boxes scattered from Massachusetts to Florida and even overseas in London and Dublin. He was not just a gangster, he was a student of espionage, a man who understood the art of disappearance. He went home to the modest house in South Boston that he shared with his girlfriend of nearly 2 decades, Teresa Stanley. He did not tell her the truth. He told her they were going on vacation, a trip to get away from the miserable Boston winter. He packed a single bag. The next day, Christmas Eve, they drove south, leaving the city lights and the kingdom he had ruled for 20 years in his rearview mirror. He was 65 years old, a ghost slipping into the twilight. Stephen Flemmy, however, made a different calculation. When Bulger relayed the warning, Flemmy was incredulous. He still believed in the system that had protected him for so long. He trusted John Connolly. He thought the agent would find a way to fix it, to get their names dropped from the indictment at the last minute, just as he had always done. He told Bulger he was staying. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. On January 5th, 1995, a massive coordinated sweep began. Teams of FBI agents and state police troopers, many of whom had spent their careers hunting these men, fanned out across the city. They smashed down the door of Stephen Flemy's mother's house, finding him there and taking him into custody. They raided other locations tied to the Winter Hill Gang, arresting key associates. But when they arrived at the house of James Bulger, they found it empty. The king was gone. The legend of South Boston had vanished, leaving behind only a cold trail and the terrifying question of how the most wanted man in the city had known they were coming. With James Bulger in the wind, the full weight of the federal indictment fell upon Stephen Flemmy. Cuffed and shackled, sitting in a sterile interrogation room, the rifleman was a shadow of his former self. His bravado crumbled as he faced the grim reality of a life sentence. But he still held one card, an ace he believed would save him: his deal with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His lawyer, a sharp defense attorney named Kenneth Fishman, filed a stunning motion in court. He argued that all charges against Flemmy should be dismissed. The reason? Flemmy, he claimed, had been an official FBI informant since 1965, long before John Connolly's involvement. He and Bulger had been given a grant of immunity by the federal government. They had been authorized implicitly and explicitly to commit crimes, including extortion and racketeering, in exchange for their intelligence on the mafia. In Flemmy's mind, he had not broken the law. He had been working for it. The claim was so outrageous, so contrary to every stated policy of the Department of Justice, that prosecutors Fred Weishak and his team initially dismissed it as a desperate fantasy. But as they were forced to respond to the motion, they began to unearth a trove of buried documents from the FBI's own archives. They found memos, informant reports, and contact logs that corroborated Flemmy's story with chilling detail. The documents revealed a secret history, a decades-long, deeply corrupt relationship that went far beyond one rogue agent. The key that unlocked the entire conspiracy was John Morris, Connolly's former supervisor. Squeezed by investigators and facing the prospect of his own indictment for taking bribes and obstructing justice, Morris broke. He agreed to cooperate. In a series of debriefings that left even the most cynical prosecutors shaken, Morris laid it all bare. He confessed to taking thousands of dollars in cash and gifts from Bulger and Flemmy. He described how Connolly had systematically leaked information, tipping them off to wiretaps, search warrants, and the identities of informants. And then he dropped the bombshell that would finally lead to the discovery of the bodies. He told them that Connolly had warned Bulger that John McIntyre was talking to the authorities, knowing full well that it was a death sentence. Armed with Morris's testimony, investigators turned their attention to Kevin Weeks, Bulger's loyal enforcer, who had also been arrested in the RICO sweep. Facing a long prison term, Weeks saw the writing on the wall. His code of silence, once absolute, now seemed like a fool's pact. In 1999, he cut a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence of just 5 years, he agreed to lead them to the graves. He took them to a desolate, windswept spot on the banks of the Neponset River, just south of Boston. Under the shadow of a massive highway bridge, he pointed to a patch of muddy ground. "Dig there," he said. Excavators clawed at the frozen earth. Soon, they found what they were looking for: the skeletal remains of 3 people, including Deborah Davis, Stephen Flemy's young girlfriend whom he had strangled in 1981 because Bulger wanted her out of the picture. Next, Weeks led them to the house on East 3rd Street in South Boston, the property they called the Haunty because of the spirits they believed dwelled there. In the dirt-floored basement, investigators unearthed the remains of John McIntyre, the fisherman executed for talking to customs. A single bullet hole was found in the back of his skull. The discovery of the bodies transformed the case. This was no longer just about racketeering. It was about a string of brutal, cold-blooded murders, all committed while the killers were on the FBI's payroll, protected by the very men sworn to uphold the law. The full, monstrous truth of the unholy alliance was finally clawing its way into the light. The hunt for Whitey Bulger, the ghost of Boston, was no longer just a manhunt. It was a race to reclaim the soul of federal justice. For 16 years, James Whitey Bulger was a phantom. His face, a haunting mugshot of cold blue eyes and thinning hair, stared out from wanted posters in post offices and on television screens across the globe. He was on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, second only to Osama bin Laden. A $2 million reward was offered for information leading to his capture. Yet, he had vanished, as if into thin air. The FBI's initial manhunt was a sprawling, expensive failure, plagued by false leads, dead ends, and the lingering shadow of its own internal corruption. Sightings were reported from Uruguay to Italy, from rural Mississippi to the coast of California. Each one was a dead end. Bulger and his devoted girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, a woman 30 years his junior who had joined him on the run shortly after he first fled, moved like smoke. They used a string of aliases: Tom and Helen, Charles and Carol Gasco, and paid for everything in cash. They were disciplined, quiet, and unassuming, blending into the anonymity of American life. For more than a decade, they lived in Santa Monica, California, in a rent-controlled apartment at the Embassy Hotel Apartments on 3rd Street, just 2 blocks from the sun-drenched Pacific Ocean. They were known as Charlie and Carol Gasco, a retired couple who kept to themselves. He was a cantankerous but harmless old man who loved books and walking his dog. She was a sweet, impeccably dressed woman who was devoted to her pets and her husband. Nobody in the quiet, palm tree-lined neighborhood suspected they were living next to America's most wanted gangster. Back in Boston, the system that had protected Bulger was being dismantled, piece by painful piece. John Connolly, the celebrated agent, was convicted in 2002 of racketeering and obstruction of justice for his role in protecting the gang. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Years later, he would face a second trial in Florida and be convicted of second-degree murder for leaking the information that led to the killing of a potential witness, John Callahan, in 1982. Stephen Flemmy, his life sentence assured, pleaded guilty to 10 murders to avoid the death penalty. He became a government witness, detailing decades of horror from the witness stand. The hunt for Bulger himself had grown cold, but in 2011, the FBI, under new leadership, decided to change its tactics. The old approach had focused on Bulger, on the grizzled, violent gangster. The new strategy, spearheaded by a team of dedicated federal agents, focused on the one person who was his weakness, Catherine Gregg. They reasoned that while Bulger was a ghost, Gregg was still a woman with vanities and habits. They launched a targeted media campaign, not in Boston, but in the cities where a woman like Gregg might seek services. They produced a 30-second public service announcement that aired during daytime television programs popular with women, shows like The View and Dr. Oz. The ad did not show Bulger's menacing face. It showed pictures of Catherine Gregg. A soft-spoken female announcer described her personality, her love of animals, her obsession with her appearance, and her need for frequent visits to the dentist and beauty salons. The message was simple. Have you seen this woman? The tip came in on June 20th, 2011. Anna Bjornsdottir, a former actress and Miss Iceland from 1974, was watching television in Reykjavik. She saw the ad. She recognized the woman on the screen instantly. It was Carol, the sweet lady who had lived in the apartment below hers in Santa Monica, the one who was always so kind to her cat. She remembered the cantankerous husband, Charlie, the man who had once pulled a knife on a building worker. She called the FBI. 2 days later, on June 22nd, a team of FBI agents set up a careful surveillance operation around the nondescript white apartment building in Santa Monica. They devised a ruse to lure Bulger out. An agent called the apartment and told Charlie Gasco that the lock on his storage locker in the garage had been broken and he needed to come down. Bulger, ever cautious, refused. He said he would handle it himself. The agents waited. Eventually, Bulger emerged from the building and walked toward the garage. He was 81 years old, stooped and frail, a pale imitation of the fearsome gangster who had terrorized a city. As he approached, a team of agents surrounded him, guns drawn. "We are the FBI," one of them said. "We know who you are."